We are indeed honored to have Professor Derek Black with us again today. Professor Black, for those of you who've been following this series for some time, was originally scheduled to talk about his book called Schoolhouse Burning, about education as a civil right, on January 7th. And you may remember that January 7th was, people had something else on their mind because of the insurrection on January 6th. And Professor Black, being a constitutional scholar, we called him and said, would you be willing to switch your topic almost overnight, actually, indeed overnight, and talk about the ramifications of what had just gone on in the Capitol? And he did. And it was a great conversation. People were really comforted to understand the constitutional issues and the durability of our democracy and the fact that we would survive. And we still are in the process of figuring out how we're going to survive, but we will. And one of the things that is really fundamental to our survival as a democracy is quality education. And so we bring Professor Black back for his original engagement, which is to talk about what it means to say that education is a crucial right to make our democracy work. His book, you can take a look at it, Schoolhouse Burning, available at your favorite bookstore. I will tell you is really worth a read. He's an incredible writer, as well as a scholar, follows the legal machinations about why the legal eagles who were designing the strategy moved in one direction or another, and looks forward at, I think perhaps the thing that came out to me the most is that our commitment to equality and public education for every child in America is an ideal. It's an ideal we strive for. We know we're not there. But when we're in this series about Toward a More Perfect Union, we know that our constitutional ideals of equality and justice are ideals we strive for. We haven't gotten there yet, but the importance is that we embrace those ideals and strive for them. So as we open today and I introduce you to Professor Black, I'd like to tell you a little bit about his background. He's a professor of law at the University of South Carolina, and his area of expertise focuses on education, law and policy, civil rights, constitutional law, particularly intersection between constitutional law and public education as it pertains to educational equality and fairness for disadvantaged students. Before he became a teacher, he was a litigator and litigated issues related to school desegregation, diversity, school finance equity, student discipline, and special education at the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. When he left that, he became a professor at the Howard University School of Law, where he founded and directed the Education Rights Center that goes on even today. We are honored to have Professor Black here with us today to take us through a significant conversation about education as a crucial civil right to build our country toward the more perfect union. Professor Black.
Thanks so much to Jane for inviting me back again, and for Sam and all, I'm sure, others who helped organize this. It's really a pleasure and a special opportunity. You know, as Jane says, the book has a wider scope that sort of touches on both the modern and the old parts of our history. What really led me here was this idea that we can't interpret a storm when we're in the middle of it. We needed to zoom out, sort of look at where we came from to understand where we are. And so 3 years of research on this book and a lifetime of background knowledge slowly led me to a single conclusion, and that is that the ideological, legal, and constitutional roots of our public education system stretch back to our nation's founding. And at our nation's two most pivotal periods, independence and the Civil War, the nation embedded public education in our constitutional democracy. Now, I didn't reach this conclusion lightly. How could such an important point have been lost? Maybe I was misinterpreting something. But as the facts mounted, my skepticism faded. And in retrospect, I can appreciate why the conventional wisdom is so sticky. Its narrative is painted so well that we rarely ask the right questions. And when we ask the wrong questions, we fail to see the truth that's right in front of us. So let me just start with the most basic facts. All 50 state constitutions include an education clause. Second, save the original colonies that predate the United States constitutions, all of the states' public education systems have been funded and expanded, at least in their infancy, by federal land grants. Now, why did the federal government dictate how states would use this land? And under what constitutional authority did they ask for these things? That is the subject of my talk today. And what I want to do is focus us on the democratic theory that drove our founders to push for public education and the notable steps that Congress took during our formative periods to help it come to be. The democratic theory begins with the ideal image of the nation that the founders sought to create. As Thomas Jefferson famously wrote, if a nation expects to be ignorant and free, it expects what never was and never will be. Before the Constitution, before we had a Constitution, our founders believed the nation needed a public education system. The United States was a radical experiment in democracy that the world simply had not seen at that point. And they believed that if this experiment had any chance of surviving the test of time, everyday citizens needed to be prepared for self-government. James Madison, our fourth president and father of our Constitution, remarked, our third, a popular government without popular information or the means of acquiring it is but a prologue to a farce or a tragedy. Now, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson spelled out the logic for public education in detail. As early as 1765, Adams tied the case for national independence to education. And in a moment of pre-revolutionary bluster, Adams wrote, a native of America who cannot read and write is as rare as a comet or an earthquake. All candid foreigners who've passed through this country and conversed freely with all sorts of people here will allow they have never seen so much knowledge and civility amongst the common people in any part of the world. But if America was to have liberty and self-government, getting out of the bluster, if it was to have those two things, Adams urged the country had further to go with education. It had to provide for the education of its youth. American education was both a predicate to self-government and a justification for independence itself. And this was not just noblesse oblige. As Adams wrote, the preservation of the means of knowledge amongst the lowest ranks is of more importance to the public than all the property of all the rich men in this country. It is even of more consequence to the rich themselves. The stability of government, the protection of private property, and the preservation of all of those other inalienable rights depended upon the education of the common man. Jefferson, in the text of the Declaration of Independence, reasoned, as we many know, quote, government only derives their just powers from the consent of the governed. We'll read Jefferson's papers and he explains that consent of the governed only exists when the common man can appreciate his own self-interest, can resist the political agenda of those who would exploit him, and preserve his own liberty. Absent education, a man simply lives under the unjust thumb of others. Public education was, in short, a natural extension of Republican government, and that meant it was government's duty to provide it to the people. Shortly after the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson and Adams began the practical work of building public education in their home states. In 1780, Adams achieved one of the most significant accomplishments in education history. He authored the Massachusetts Constitution, and in it he wrote, and this is the oldest working constitution in the world. In it, he placed education at the center of his understanding of government. And that Constitution declared, quote, wisdom and knowledge, diffused generally among the body of the people, are necessary for the preservation of their rights and liberties. Thus it shall be the duty of legislatures and magistrates in all future periods of this Commonwealth to cherish the public schools. Those two fundamental concepts, that education is the citizenry's best guarantee of their other rights, and that the collective public body has a duty to provide it. Those two things became the model for state and national activity. But the deep impact of Jefferson and Adams' work is often missed, but we can find it if we just work to connect the dots a few years later. So in the mid and late 1780s, Congress was focused on westward expansion into the Northwest Territories. Let me share a few pictures for us. Right here, Jane is from Ohio. Ohio being the first of those Northwest territories. Congress is focused on moving beyond the colonies, growing the country, and figuring out how to do that. To do that, it needs to wrest away control of the territories from the colonies and bring it in to the national scheme and develop a coherent plan for it. Congress had that opportunity in 1785 and 1787, and it does that in the Northwest ordinances of those years. Those Northwest ordinances place public education at the literal center of the nation's plan for geographic expansion. If you look at this, what you would see is that in the Northwest Territories, every square inch of land is divided up into these little blocks. And the center blocks, in fact, precisely the 16th lot in each town, was mandated to be reserved for public schools. Those towns were also to set aside 1/9 of the overall land in those squares for generating resources for public schools, and 1/3 of the natural resources that all of that land generated. Right? Congress puts public education literally at the center of. I forgot to share the picture. Congress puts them literally at the center of growth in the country, here being the Northwest Territories, and this being the chopped up version of every piece of land all the way westward, with that little center square, including the 16th lot where public schools were to exist. Stop the share. Now, the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 was more constitutional than technical. Rather than dividing things up into squares, it declares the various rights of citizens and the goals that these territories must pursue if they are to become states. Things like freedom of religion, jury by trial, prohibitions against cruel and unusual punishment, prohibitions against the deprivation of liberty and property. All of these things are found in the Northwest Ordinance. And right alongside them, the Northwest Ordinance declares, in language mirroring the Massachusetts Constitution, that as a necessity of good government and the happiness of mankind, schools and the means of education shall forever be encouraged in these territories. The ordinance's lofty language and the land grants alone, however, were not enough to fully support a nationwide system of education. Land in an undeveloped frontier, quite frankly, isn't worth much. But what's important is that Congress gave what it had. And at that moment, all it had was land. Now, the skeptics of Congress's fundamental role in education will say, nice story, Derek, but the ordinances were statutes, and they were superseded by the Constitution. The ordinance can't be so easily dismissed. First of all, every single bound copy of the United States Legal Code includes the nation's 4 organic laws at the front. Now, 3 of those organic laws will be no surprise to you. The first is the Declaration of Independence. Another are the 1777 Articles of Confederation. And the fourth is the U.S. Constitution. Nestled between the Articles of Confederation and the U.S. Constitution is what? The Northwest Ordinance of 1787. It rests there because the Northwest ordinances were intertwined with the Constitution's adoption. First, several delegates to the Constitutional Convention simultaneously served in the Continental Congress. Let's throw another picture up here for you real quick. In fact, during the summer of 1787, the Continental Congress, pictured there on the right, which was in New York at the time, the Continental Congress lacked a quorum for most of the summer of 1787. Why? Because so many of them were in Philadelphia, in the picture on your left, at the Constitutional Convention. So late in the summer of 1787, the Secretary of Congress sends a letter to the Constitutional Convention saying, "It is absolutely necessary for the great purpose of the Union that some of you return to New York to do the nation's work." What was it that was so important for them to do, to leave the Constitutional Convention in the summer of 1787? It was to pass the Northwest Ordinance. So we had delegates from New York and North Carolina, I think it was, that make the trip from Philadelphia to New York. And within a few days, they do one thing. They pass the Northwest Ordinances. Remarkably, by a unanimous vote. So we cannot separate the people, the times, and the place of the Northwest Ordinances from the Constitution. Second, the Northwest Ordinances themselves, as a matter of substance, right, are a constitutional charter of sorts. Practically speaking, they established a foundational structure for the nation to grow and organize itself for the next 2 centuries. In fact, more than 30 of the states to the Union have, which is basically all of them except for the original colonies and the ones that came shortly thereafter, basically all of them entered the Union pursuant to the rules and procedures of the Northwest Ordinance. They are also the first detailed articulation of norms and rights in this country. And as I hinted at earlier, those norms and rights in the Northwest Ordinance are transferred into the Constitution itself. Third, the Northwest Ordinances are intertwined as the land deal that makes the Constitution possible. Before we have a Constitution, we simply have a confederation of friends, as they called it. And those friends didn't get it, more like a family, so they didn't get along so well quite often. Basically, all of the colonies claimed that they owned all the land west of them to the coast. You've got Virginia, Pennsylvania, Connecticut, all of them claiming they own the Northwest Ordinances. If the United States as a constitutional democracy is going to move forward, those states have to give up that land to the federal government and agree on the rules by which that land will become states like Ohio, Illinois, et cetera, rather than the provinces of Pennsylvania, Virginia, et cetera. And the significance of the Northwest Ordinance agenda also echoes through the early presidencies. Let's go to Washington for just a moment. In his farewell address to the nation, he wrote an open letter that was republished throughout the country. And he refocuses the nation on the unique challenges of our democracy. He offers this maxim: promote then as an object of primary importance institutions for the general diffusion of knowledge. The amount of education was to be in proportion to the type of government that we wanted in this country. And again, in his final annual message to Congress, 3 months before leaving office, he expresses Congress to make good on its education commitments. He writes, "The assimilation of the principles, opinions, and manners of our countrymen by the common education of a portion of our youth from every quarter well deserves your attention. The more homogeneous our citizens can be in these particulars, the greater will be our prospects of a permanent union. And a primary object of a national institution should be the education of our youth in the science of government. In a republic, what species of knowledge can be equally important, and what duty more pressing on this legislature than to patronize a plan for communicating to the people, to those individuals who are going to be the future guardians of the liberties of the country." Jefferson made similar requests and demands of Congress, saying education is here placed amongst the articles of public care because a public institution alone can supply the sciences which, though rarely called for, are yet necessary to complete the circle, all parts of which contribute to the improvement of the country, even to its preservation. Now, Jefferson made one more request. He asked Congress to take all of its excess funds and devote them to one thing, public education. And he said, if we don't want to do it, we should amend the Constitution. In 1826, Congress revisits the Northwest Ordinance, recognizing the need to create more public schools. It now requires states to reserve even more land for public schools than had the 1785 ordinance. And then in 1836, when the nation accrues its very first surplus after being indebted from the Revolutionary War, its very first surplus, it turns the entirety of that surplus over to the states, calling it the people's inheritance. And what do they do with that? They spend it on education. In fact, 8 of the states spent every single penny that they received from Congress on public education. Now, viewed from a distance, the ordinances earned a place next to the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution because they represent the hopes and aspirations of what the nation was trying to become. And they can only fully be understood through their reach, not their grasp. Through their reach, we can see the Northwest Ordinances for what they were: the nation's first attempt to set a North Star for education. Before the Constitution itself would mandate a Republican form of government in the states, before the Civil War period, in which we'll get to in a moment, when Congress would mandate constitutional changes, the Northwest Ordinances mandated Republican government and provided for public education's central role in it. In doing so, they placed public education on a plane different than anything else that government does. Now, far less understood, but just as important, were the steps that Congress took during Reconstruction. By the end of the Civil War, Congress had come to see the folly in relying on the good faith intentions and efforts of states. The Union had nearly been lost. And if it was to be rebuilt, it had to stand on its original ideas and embed them in far more concrete terms. As to education, this time, Congress devised and adopted a strategy that would far outlive the war and entail irreversible formal action at the very highest levels of state government. In 1867, on the floor of the Senate, Charles Sumner offered his take on the link between democracy's failure and the non-existent system of education in the South. And he said, in a republic, education is indispensable. A republic without education is like a creature of the imagination, a human being without a soul, living and moving blindly like a monster. It is a monster. Such have been the rebel states, but such they must no longer be. It is not too much to say that had these states been more enlightened, they would have never rebelled. The barbarism of slavery would have shrunk into insignificance without sufficient force to break forth in blood. But a population that could not read and write naturally failed to comprehend and appreciate a Republican form of government. Senator Morton of Indiana followed Sumner with a reality check on the challenges that stood ahead. Many of those most in need of education, Senator Morton argued, were too poor to secure it for themselves. So he said, education must be provided by the state or they will remain uneducated. And until they are educated, the political power remains almost entirely in the hands of the present rebel-educated class. And this line, I think, ought to be as relevant today as ever. Republican government may go on for a while half the voters remain unable to read or write, but it cannot long endure. The truth was that the United States was no longer just a democratic experiment. It was an experiment that had failed in crucial respects. So 3/4 of a century after its founding, and with a civil war behind it, the nation stiffened its resolve. Between 1865 and 1868, the nation embarked on the most aggressive education project before or since, rapidly turning the education world upside down. Where Congress had previously been deferential, it became aggressive. It was this magic period that public education became not just a national aspiration, not just a fundamental value, but a constitutional requirement. Now, were there time, I would explore the Freedmen's Bureau, which spent 2/3 of its budget on education, helped establish and maintain 4,000 schools, hired 9,000 teachers, and educate over 200,000 freedmen. But in the interest of time, I'll just note that the Freedmen's Bureau, along with the freedmen themselves, laid the practical and political foundation for broader congressional action during Reconstruction. Congress's first move was to create a federal Department of Education to work alongside the Freedmen's Bureau once the Freedmen's Bureau ran down. And it signaled that the project to expand education was not just for the freedmen, it was for everyone. It was about continuing the promise first laid out by Washington, Adams, Jefferson, and others. In the legislative preamble of that 1867 department, the preamble of the legislation stated, whereas Republican institutions can find permanent safety only upon the basis of universal intelligence of the people, and whereas the great disasters which have afflicted the nation and desolated 1/2 of its territory are traceable in a great degree to the absence of common schools and general education amongst the people. So they instructed this new group to inquire into the expediency of establishing a new Bureau of Education whose duty it shall be to enforce education. The possibility of a far-reaching Department of Education then, as in now, caused some to be squeamish. That there was now this question of the appropriate federal role. But those like Representative Mason Moulton beat them back and explained that this commitment to education was part of our founding ideas and those who had sacrificed their lives for it. From the floor, Moulton said, the two great pillars of our American republic upon which it rests are universal liberty and universal education. We have established universal liberty through a bloody conflict, through 4 years of carnage and war, and Congress, by the passages of the Civil Rights Bill, has provided the machinery by which universal liberty can be enforced and guaranteed. So one of those pillars rests upon a solid foundation. The other pillar is universal public education. And so long as universal education rested on unsure footing, so too would the nation. So the department was charged with unifying and creating a plan of education. He said it was the crying necessity of this day to correct the mischievous errors that had crept into our systems of education and must now be eradicated. In the end, Congress approved that department by a wide margin. Just a few months after creating the department, Congress moved on to even grander plans, imposing education conditions on southern states who wanted to re-enter the Union. This time, Congress had the chance to do something constitutional, not just legislative. In 1867, all 10 of the Confederate states in the Deep South still wanted to rejoin the Union. The Reconstruction Acts of 1867 and 1868 spelled out 4 conditions for re-entering the Union. 1, they had to rewrite their constitution. 2, they had to extend the ballot to blacks. 3, they had to submit those new constitutions to Congress for approval. And lastly, they had to ratify the 14th Amendment. Now, the one that got all the attention was the ratification of the 14th Amendment. I won't talk about that today. The other conditions flew under the radar to some extent, but they were no less important. And there was an education hook carefully embedded in them. The new requirement of writing new constitutions required that they conform their constitutions to the U.S. Constitution in all respects so as to establish Republican forms of government. Now, to the casual observer who hasn't been tasked with listening to me for 20 minutes, you might say, a Republican form of government sounds pro forma. But in historical context, it was the ideological concept for demanding public education. And they were explicitly invoking that concept because it was the very thing that the southern states had failed to do. Now Congress was calling on southern states to to task for their failures and using readmission to the Union as the basis to demand them to fix it. The real question was whether the requirement of a Republican form of government by itself, that general statement, would be enough, or whether Congress should be even more specific. Charles Sumner, again, didn't want to leave anything to doubt. Sumner moved not just to make education an explicit condition of Confederate states readmission, but racially mixed education. His amendment to the Reconstruction Act would require, quote, that states establish and sustain a system of public schools open to all, comma, without distinction of race or color, in 1867. Sumner believed this condition was important as anything else Congress could do. He had introduced tons of amendments and said he would drop them all if Congress would just commit to this single one. Sumner wasn't alone. Several others came to his aid. Morton simplified the issue into one of basic political reality. He said, when you add to the uneducated whites and the uneducated Negroes, you have a full half of the voting population in the South unable to read and write. And we cannot expect men who own the property to voluntarily tax themselves to educate other people. So unless states provide public education at public expense, the masses will remain illiterate and political power outside of their reach. In other words, Congress was wasting its time with Reconstruction if it was not serious about guaranteeing public education. Illiteracy for both poor whites and the freedmen was too disabling, and vested property interests of whites were too strong for the nation to change, or for the South to change without it. So in the end, sadly, Sumner's amendment fails by one vote. Actually, the vote was tied. No one cast the tiebreaker. That would have been Andrew Johnson at the moment. No, not at that moment. Scratch that. But the vice president failed to cast the deciding vote. But it wasn't because of an objection to education. It was an objection to this without race or color phrase that Sumner had added in. Now, the dissenters, those who voted against it, still reserved, however, the right to reject any constitution that did not live up to a Republican form of government, and they all knew exactly what that meant at that moment. So, true to form, all of the state constitutions in the South through 1868 did exactly what Congress expected. They extended the vote to African Americans, and they provided for education. Let me just show you a graphic of that quickly. So the chart to the right shows you the percentage of states that had, Southern Confederate states, that had affirmative education clauses before the war, and you can see the rapid change to a uniform sort of adoption of them. And here I'll show you the national growth as well, that we have less than half of the states providing for public education in their constitutions prior to the war, but afterwards a rapid rise through 67 up through 70, in which it's over 80% of the states providing for it. Now, something unfortunately happened in 1868 that made Congress think it needed to be a little bit more specific. Georgia had re-entered the Union. It had amended its constitution to provide for education. And as soon as Georgia was admitted to the Union, it expelled all the African American legislators from the General Assembly. Now Congress is concerned. You see, we readmitted these southern states, and Georgia has shown us they can go backwards as quickly as we can force them to go forward. At that moment in time, there are 3 states that remain outside the Union: Virginia, Texas, and Mississippi. So now Congress does what Charles Sumner had urged it to do earlier. In the legislation readmitting those 3 states, Congress explicitly provided that constitutions of those states, quote, shall never be so amended or changed as to deprive any citizen or class of citizens of the United States of the school rights and privileges secured by the Constitution of said states. Mississippi is in federal court right now for its failure to live up to this term, in 1868. 1868 is, in effect, the year that the education world is inverted. Prior to the 1860s, less than half of the states, as I said, provided for education in their constitutions. In the 3 years immediately following the Civil War, that percentage jumps to over 80. And after 1868, no state ever again enters the Union of the United States of America without guaranteeing education in its constitution. This was no accident. To go back to the basic fact I stated at the beginning of my talk. So what should we make of this history and its connection to today? First, the federal role in education is not of modern vintage. When Congress passed the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965, many saw it as the dawning of an important new day. Many others saw it as an enormous and anomalous incursion that was into an area reserved to the states. Neither of those two things is true. It only appeared that way because Jim Crow segregation and its norms had thrust Congress into a century-long slumber. Second, the federal role in education is not social policy akin to healthcare, welfare, or Social Security. The federal role in education is a commitment to republicanism, the very theories upon which our constitutional democracy rests. And finally, the commitment at the federal or state level ought not be understood as voluntary. Our Constitution, our federal Constitution, demands Republican forms of government. And painful experience, blood and war have taught us that it does not exist without public education. And thus, the state constitutional provisions protecting education in every state exist because Congress demanded as much, and the states themselves recognize the wisdom in it and acquiesce. And with that, I'm happy to answer as many questions as I can in the next 20 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Black. I feel like we've had a whole history lesson about from the dawn of our country to now about how it is that we've set education as part of our state constitutions as well as the role of Congress in trying to engage that. We've got several interesting questions from our listeners, and I think I'll start with the first one is that as the discussion was about that education had to be important from the founders of our country on, did the folks who were advocating for education think about it as universal, or did they think about it just for the male children from the privileged classes?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And the other theme and thesis of the book is that the expansion of democracy has gone hand in hand with the expansion of two things, the ballot and the schoolhouse doors. So we said lots of wonderful things in the Declaration of Independence. We said lots of wonderful things in the Northwest Ordinances and in the Constitution. We all know that there was no such thing as democracy for women, for many poor whites without land, and of course there was not even basic liberty for African Americans. So the story of the book is really to say that at each moment that democracy expands to include poor whites, for instance, or former slaves, that the public education system is right there, bringing them into that public body, preparing them for citizenship. So the question is right on. Right? There is no golden age in which we have operated a real democracy. There's no golden age in which education was perfect. Never was perfect, and probably won't be in my lifetime. But what it has been, what public education has been, is part of that story of how do we create a more perfect union. And each step to create a more perfect union has been facilitated through our public schools. So excellent question, and we've still got plenty of room to go.
Well, thanks. Now, other question is, in this whole question of equity of education, sort of a twofold question. Would you like to comment on the status of civic education at this point? And is there any role for the federal government to deal with the content of education?
Yeah, I mean, this is a crucially important point. We talked a little bit about it on January the 7th, but we clearly have a civics problem. We have a rule of law problem, and the assault on the Capitol on the 6th surely shows that. But even without the insurrection, what we see is that our schools teach far less civics, far less government and social studies than they used to, in part because they're not on our standardized tests. Now, I'm not suggesting we should put civics on our standardized test, but the problem is we've got a curriculum that's driven by what's on a test rather than what children need. And so, the national founding is about preparation for citizenship. So without question, we should double down there. As for Congress's role in it, Congress actually established a bipartisan commission, which is not something we get so often, but in the last year of the Obama administration, there was a bipartisan commission established to study service, national service. Because what we found over the last few decades, increasingly hard to recruit folks into armed services and all other forms of government service, right? That we don't have a public that is as interested in those opportunities and committed to them. So I had the opportunity to testify before that commission to explain much of what I just told you today, that of course, right, if we look at everything I've said today, that the nation needs not only to have people show up and vote, they need people to do service. They need people to be good civic citizens. And Congress certainly has an appropriate role in trying to encourage and foster that. Now, I don't want to put people to sleep as to the policy details of how we could, should, or shouldn't achieve that. But without a doubt, I think Congress needs to get on that front and center, because it's in part Congress's standardized testing regime that drove us further away from that type of civics engagement over the last 2 decades.
Well, it's certainly there are several of our listeners are congressional staff, so hopefully their ears are open as you offer these opportunities. Someone has asked about a particular case that you might have information about, which is what if any is the impact of the Pierce versus the Society of Sisters decision about parental rights on the commitment of the federal government to education?
Yeah, Pierce versus Society of Sisters, for those who don't know, is a case in which the state of Oregon had mandated that all children attend public education, which then had the effect of prohibiting them from going to private Catholic school. Now, there was a lot of anti-Catholicism built up in that measure. But Pierce versus Society of Sisters, the Supreme Court holds that the state can mandate that children be educated, but it cannot mandate that they receive it in public schools. So that if a parent decides for religious reasons or other that they want religious education, the state can't stop that. So what, if anything, does that have to do with the conversation today? To be quite honest, it doesn't have a lot to do with it. It's really more about a parent being able to, if they so choose, pursue private education, but it doesn't limit the state in requiring that they receive education. I might also add, Pierce versus Society of Sisters did say that the state can also make sure that nothing contrary to good citizenship is taught in those schools. So I think what we understand Pierce to be is an accommodation for those who, for religious reasons, may want to do something else, but it doesn't obligate the state to help them. It doesn't obligate the state to ignore that kids need good citizenship in those schools.
And that's very helpful. One of the you referred to the current Mississippi case and how they're referring back to that sort of landmark legislation that dealt with the reentry into the Union. And one of our listeners would like to understand a little bit better about what are the issues and what's going on with Mississippi right now.
Yeah, I mean, Mississippi is a fascinating case. Some people could listen to this conversation and go, "Oh, Derek is lost in old books." But But you look at this Mississippi case and you understand that the past is right here with us in determining current issues. So the issue, so that text that I read you, what it says is that those states, those readmitted states, could never deprive any child of the education rights just vested in those constitutions. So the simpler way of saying that is, once you are admitted with an education clause, you're prohibited from retrogressing or going backwards in some way. So that's the principle, right? Well, in 1891, the Jim Crow segregationist convention met in Mississippi and definitely went back on education. Now, the problem was that there wasn't a federal court or a state court in this country that cared anything about African American rights, so they let them. Short story. Finally, after Brown versus Board of Education, right, the court mandates the integration of schools. It says actually where a state provides education, it must do it equally. Well, after that, Mississippi decided maybe the best way to do this is to reduce some of what we're providing, to provide less, to provide more discretion at the state level. And that'll allow us to avoid the Brown versus Board of Education issue. So Mississippi goes backwards again following Brown versus Board of Education and has stayed there in many respects over the last few decades. The theory in this current case is that Mississippi, by going backwards in 1891, and maybe more importantly, going backwards after Brown versus Board of Education, is violating the terms, the 1868 terms of readmission, because it told Mississippi, if you want to be a member of this country, you got to provide for public education. You can't go backwards. So that is what's going on there. There's some other legal nuances regarding justiciability, but I won't get into those with us here today.
Okay, we're coming up on our time, so how about we do lightning round? We got a few quick ones. Someone asked, when James Smithson gave his gifts to the federal government to create the Smithsonian Institution, did they tie the provision of education to their ability to accept those gifts?
Wow, we may need to turn the mic on for your listener there. That's beyond me. I'll have to research that. I don't know much about that gift.
Those are our listeners. We got somebody doing something new. Okay, we're going to give you a short question, and then I'm going to give you the big question at the end. So the short question is, you've been talking about K through 12. Could you quickly say, how does this relate to higher education?
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly a lot of folks who say, look, it mandates an education for citizenship, other things, and if that goal is not done by K through 12, and many of us would say it's not fully done, that we ought to owe more. I'll just confess, maybe to the disappointment of some, that as a matter of originalism, given that the institutions of higher education were not really much of a prevalent thing at that time, it would be hard to argue as a matter of originalism that that's what our constitutions were requiring. On the other hand, if you look, this isn't a matter of originalism, this is a matter of what is the end result. So if what you want to do is produce fully informed citizens and people who can go out into the world and take care of themselves and lead productive lives, then something beyond high school, it has to be part of that. You could also say, as some do even in the K through 12 context, that these lines of K and 12 are rather arbitrary. Why not pre-K through 12? Why not pre-K through 13? So, I guess I might confess that these lines are arbitrary, although they do have historical roots. And it's not outside of the question that we should require higher education. If you look at the state constitutions, most of them do obligate the state to create higher education as well. I guess my only response would be those are not as closely tied to this republicanism theory. I think they're more closely tied to the state just saying this is a good policy that we want to commit to, forever. And so I guess that's the best I could say.
It's good for a lawyer who's a historian at the same time. So that's fabulous. Now, the final question is kind of a two-part question. One is, how do we solve for funding public education when so much of it is built on the property tax, which inherently uh, provides more resources for the better to do districts?
Yeah,
And in that context, what would be your perspective on some of the contemporary assaults on public education? How do we square all that with the sense of history and moving forward?
yeah. So we try to separate those into two things real quickly. So as to the financing of education through property taxes, I'll tell you there's a portion of the book that talks about the Jim Crow constitutional conventions in the South, and I'm doing some additional research on that right now. But the interesting thing is that in the immediate aftermath of the war, the funding for public education was statewide. It was financed, ironically, through poll taxes that African Americans supported because they wanted to fund public education. Those poll taxes would come in, go to the state. The state would give those poll taxes to the state superintendent of education, who's also an elected figure in the state constitutions, and then distribute them out equally. What happened during, at least in the South, during Jim Crow segregation, was that they didn't want to provide equal education, obviously, to African Americans. And they knew that if they had a state officer, the state superintendent, saying, well, I'm giving $2 to white kids and $1 to black kids, that they, even as bad as the courts were, they might get in trouble for that. So the solution to that for the segregationists was to move fiscal responsibility for public schools to the local level, and then they could just sort of say that they've wiped their hands clean of it. If discrimination is happening between districts, that's not Mississippi's fault, right? Even though that's Mississippi's motivation. So the short story there is there, at least in the South, are deep roots of inequity built into the very decision to fund education locally, that it made segregation and inequality possible. Now, your second question, remind me your second question again.
What is your perspective on some of the assaults that are going on against public education right now?
Yeah, that was the premise of the entire book, was that what we have seen in voucher and charter legislation, particularly in what now I call the voucher spring, is one, the questioning of whether public education is even a good idea, and the taking of public resources from those schools and transferring them to private institutions. Now, for many people, this is just a matter of policy, right? What policy can produce what results? That is how people justify it. The point of this book is to understand, is to make the claim that if you understand that public education is about values, fundamental American values, then these attempts to raid the public education coffers and to move children into private sectors is actually an attack on our very theory of democracy itself. And if we wake up someday with no longer a system of public education, we may not very well have democratic values to fight for anymore. And so that's the alarm bell that I try to ring, is that the current efforts are an assault on democracy itself, not just an assault on public education.
Well, Professor Black, you've given us a great deal to think about. Thank you so much for your time, your talent, your book. We will share with people information about the book as they move forward. This lecture is recorded and will be available on our website, so that if you listen to it and you think somebody should listen, it's there for the public. We thank you all for your support, for being here. Let's take a look ahead at what's coming up in the educational series. Not look ahead to the 18th. Next Thursday, we're going to have a fascinating conversation about the incredible emerging role of women in Republican politics. A dialogue between Dr. Catherine Leiniger, who is our scholar, whose book called Gendering the GOP, Intra-Party Politics and Republican Women's Representation in Congress is just about to come out, And she will be in conversation with former Florida Representative Elena Ross Layton, who served for nearly 30 years as a Republican woman and has a great deal of perspective about the changes that have happened in the Republican Party over time as women have engaged. We go back to our lunch bites for great fun conversation on the 23rd, where we learn about the Fina Mendoza mysteries, where a 10-year-old sleuth comes to the State of the Union and gets involved. And it's a fun way to do civic education through stories. We also want to make sure that everyone is aware that on the 25th of March, we're going to celebrate 25 years of Steve Livengood serving as our chief tour guide. And so we hope that you'll join us for a festive but virtual toast to Steve's activity. Join us for that. And as we move into April, the series goes to begin to look at the engagement with Native Americans. From the founding of our Constitution, there was a recognition that there was tribal sovereignty even within the United States Constitution. How has that translated over time? So it should be a fascinating conversation. We again thank you. All of these are available only because of the support of members and friends of the United States Capitol Historical Society. Thank you. Thank you for being our supporters. Thank you for sharing this information with your friends, neighbors, and loved ones. We look forward to seeing you next week at this same time. Be well.